In 1912, medical missionary Dr. William Leslie went to live and minister to tribal people in a remote corner of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Dr. Leslie and his wife Clara spent 17 years in the missions outpost at Vanga, but their service ended on a rocky note. A modern missionary working in the area told the story. He said Dr. Leslie had a relational falling out with some of the tribal leaders and was asked not to return. They did have some reconciliation later. There were apologies and forgiveness, but it didn't end like he hoped. His goal was to spread Christianity, but he felt like he never really made an impact. After 17 years, William and Clara returned to the U.S. discouraged, believing that they had failed to make any change for Christ. William died 9 years later after his return. I think sometimes we turn our famous first verse in this passage and the Christian idea of faith itself into the subject of kind of a Hallmark card Christianity. It's flowery and rainbows and puppy dogs, and we make faith an element of the speed bumpless life. But in the context of the book of Hebrews, this chapter-long hall of faith, as I've heard it put before, this monument to God's faithfulness and to the faith of His people, is intentionally placed in the middle of an extended discussion about not giving up on faith because of the hardships that we face in life. There's a reason that this long section of the chapter is given to the discussion of saints at the end who were tortured and faced jeers and flogging, were imprisoned and even put to death in gruesome ways. Faith isn't always easy. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote, "Faith sees best in the dark." And this morning we're going to learn about that kind of faith. We're going to see how our passage defines faith. We're going to look at some of the characteristics of the faithful who are described here. And then we're going to look at the object of their faith. What were they having faith in? We're not going to read the entire chapter, but we're going to skip around quite a bit inside. I'll help you stay with me. We're going to start with chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Would you read chapter 11, verses 1 through 3 with me? Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Verse 1 is probably one of the 10 or 12 most well-known verses in the Bible. I memorized it as a kid as faith is the evidence of things hoped for, the substance of things unseen. Maybe you know it as faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. That's what happens when you have a very poetic verse with some range for using different exact words for the same concept. But regardless of which specific terms we're dropping in there, the message is clear. Faith gives substance to things that are intangible. It gives solidness to things that we can't touch. What does that look like? What does it mean? Verse 3 gives us a really clear line to follow on this connection. It gives us an example of what faith does. Faith gives us the confidence to know, to have certainty about questions on which we have no personal method of proving or testing truth. I mean, how old are you? Don't say it out loud. I'm not trying to be rude this morning. But the Bible tells us that the world is at a bare minimum thousands upon thousands of years old. Much of modern science would argue for a value more in the billions of years. But regardless, were you there? No, you weren't. Sarcastic answers aside. No, none of us were there when the world started, when time began. But as Christians, we have faith about certain details of creation because we believe what the Bible tells us. Now, maybe you're hanging out with us this morning and you're doing a little bit of scoffing right now. You don't really buy into this religious stuff. You're a person of logic and knowledge and science or something along those lines. First off, thanks for spending time with us. I get that this probably wasn't your first choice this morning, and you're likely with us because you care about somebody who did want to be here. So thank you for that. Thank you for caring for them in that way. But second, I want to challenge your scoffing a little bit because I think you're operating on faith too, whether you know it or not. Because the more, and I want to speak in a language that maybe you'll buy into more, the more research that we do, the more we realize that that's just how we operate as human beings. Malcolm Gladwell is not a Christian, he's an agnostic, who wrote a book about how we relate to each other as human beings, how we decide to trust or not trust other people when we meet them, when we're spending time with them. And he found something strange in digging into all this research. He wrote of human beings as a whole, we do not behave like sober-minded scientists slowly gathering evidence of the truth or falsity of something before we reach a conclusion. We do the opposite. We start by believing and we stop believing only when our doubts or misgivings rise to the point that we can no longer explain them away. In other words, our default human behavior is to choose what to have faith in, to buy into it, to believe it, and only then to start interpreting the world around us in light of that faith, in light of those things that we assume to be true. If you're here today and you say, forget that religious faith, I have facts, I have science or reason or philosophy or whatever it is, and I can know that that's true, well, then the obvious question there is, how? How do you know that it's true? What if the laws of physics changed 10,000 years ago and the universe isn't as consistent as you think it is? What if we're all living in a simulation, full-on Matrix mode? What if all the scientists around the world are in on the greatest conspiracy in human history, and everything you've been taught is a deception so that they can hog the real science to themselves? I don't think any of those are actually true. But how do you know that they're not? The answer is you can't. You cannot prove those things necessarily. To know that they're not true, you're using a combination of common sense, general intelligence, and faith. You're choosing to believe certain things and then interpreting the world around those. Because that's what we all do. We choose a big picture view of the world and then we interpret life through that. And so for us as human beings, faith becomes the evidence of things unseen, the substance of things hoped for. It gives solidity to the places in our life where we need to believe something, we choose to believe something, and we can't necessarily prove it. We can't necessarily test it. It's not, But it's really important to note that a good faith is not a blind faith. Again, maybe you're here and you're not a Christian, or you're watching online, and maybe you're worried about that. You're worried about, well, if I buy into Jesus, I have to dump all my questions at the door. I have to stop thinking through these things. No, quite the opposite. We as Christians are still figuring things out in life. We're struggling with our own questions too. Elizabeth Elliot was a missionary and writer, and she said, faith doesn't eliminate questions. Faith knows where to take them. In fact, we're trying as Christians to push deeper into harder questions than we would face if we limited ourselves to just questions about the visible, physical reality around us. We want to dig into questions about the nature of life, about who we were meant to be as individuals and communities, about the purpose of beauty, about whether there's meaning behind the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. We want to dive into these big questions together, and I think that there's something in you that wants to dive into those too. So I hope that you'll spend time with us again. Hang out, find somebody among us with whom to have deep conversations about this stuff. And this morning, we're going to turn the corner from what faith is, kind of describing it, seeing how we all operate on the basis of faith, choosing to believe in things that we cannot see based on our trust and belief in someone else's word, to now looking at the individuals who are called out in this chapter for their faith, and especially what characteristics they have in common. What we're going to do here is I'm going to pick a handful of verses to illustrate each of three commonalities. This passage could be its own sermon series. We aren't going to get close to hitting everything, but I want to make sure we see three general themes that run through the different individuals and groups mentioned throughout this hall of faith. The first theme is this: these are not exactly perfect people that we're seeing here. And in fact, the group includes the downtrodden and some pretty notorious sinners. We're going to read chapter 11, verses 8, 11, 21, 31, and 32, just getting a sampling throughout. Verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. Verse 11, by faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Verse 21, by faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. Verse 31 and then 32. By faith, Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and all the prophets. We'll leave off there. The first thread that we need to notice about the faithful as we dive into their narratives is that this is not the story of a spotless people. This is not the epic of the untouchable or the tale of the totally pure. Rather, what we find here is a litany of the faulty. From Abraham, who so often throughout his story falls to fear and gives in to the pressure of others, to Sarah, who scoffs at God's promises and ends up punishing others for her bad decisions, to Jacob, whose life was in many ways defined by his trickiness, his deceitful nature, to Rahab, who's identified by her profession, which was prostitution, before becoming a part of the people of God, to Samson, whose life was defined by pride until about 5 minutes before his death. Broken person after broken person, but they're included in the hall of faith, the litany of the faithful. There's a book that I really love where there's a character who is trying to help another achieve their destiny, to become a hero like in the great stories of old. But our would-be hero is plagued with self-doubt, depression, and feelings of powerlessness. And at one point he snaps at his would-be mentor. He says, "You want too much from me. I'm not some glorious knight of ancient days. I'm a broken man, do you hear me? I am broken." But the mentor, instead of becoming upset that their kindness is being repaid with anger, the mentor comes over to the would-be hero and says, "That's what they all were." And that's what we're getting at here in the passage. It's so important that these characters aren't perfect, because we're not either. We mess up, we doubt, we all fall in our own ways to fear or selfishness, to pride or laziness, whatever it may be, we find our own personal ways to mess up. And if being part of the faithful meant you needed to do it all right, we'd be toast. But we don't get a list of superhuman beacons of perfection here. No, we mostly get a list of a bunch of sinners and screw-ups. And that's the kind of list that I'm qualified to be a part of too. So first, it's important that they are imperfect people. And the second thing we see about the list is that it's a list of imperfect people who took action because of their faith. Noah built an ark. Abraham went out from his house. Moses faced Pharaoh. Rahab hid the spies. In verses 33 and 34, we get a list, and it says he's talking about those who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, and put foreign armies to flight. And then the chapter kind of wraps up with a litany, a list of unnamed believers who braved torture and execution for their faith. It's a litany of flawed people, yes, but it is a litany of flawed people who acted upon their faith. Not perfectly, not without making any mistakes, but they took action. Dr. Tony Evans is one of our great modern preachers and teachers. He once wrote, "Faith isn't merely feeling like God is telling the truth, nor is it saying God is telling the truth. For faith to truly be faith, it involves acting like God is telling the truth. That's why the Bible calls it walking by faith and not talking by faith or even feeling by faith." I love that point, this idea that faith requires action in order to be real. Again, this doesn't mean that we're perfect. This doesn't mean that we have every answer. Some of our actions are going to end up being mistaken. But we grow and we change and we keep our eyes focused on God and we keep taking action, walking in faith based on what God has told us. Christian author and counselor K.J. Ramsey had a similar point when she wrote, "Every day you are invited to be the kid who shows up to listen to Jesus and offers the little bit he has to help feed the crowd." Faith is showing up, giving out of your smallness with open hands, and finding that Jesus will do with it more than you can imagine. Walking in faith doesn't mean I'm going to have everything perfect. It means I'm going to take action based on the promises of God and trust Him for the result. So we saw first, the faithful are not perfect. They were broken and imperfect people like us, being renewed in the image of God. And now we found that they took action out of their faith. And third, last, we find that those in the litany of the faithful were looking to the future. They were trusting in promises, whether they saw the end of those promises or not. There's many examples of this, but I think the two best are in verses 13 to 16 and 39 to 40. "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared for them a city." And then verse 39. "And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect." There are so many things in your life that want you to believe that they will make everything better, that they will be your home, your safety, your peace. This is the heart of every addiction. Everyone will at some point make the same promise: I will be the thing that makes it all better. Our political parties would love nothing more than for you to believe that giving one of them as much power as humanly possible will be the thing that makes all the bad things go away and makes the world, or at least our country, into the true home that you deserve. Our industrial and technological society gives us the angle of being told from certain sectors that the relentless march of progress will fix everything eventually. But the litany of the faithful here reminds us that all of those different solutions, that any solution that isn't wholly focused on Jesus, is bound to fail us eventually. We aren't looking for something to make our current world perfect. We are looking forward to a rebirth, a resurrection of the world coming back to life and being made new again. And that doesn't mean that we don't work for the good of our community or of our families. Certainly not. What it means is that we have hope when the hard times come, because we weren't depending on things being good for our faith, for our hope to be real. It means that our worth is not found in defeating the darkness around us, but in being faithful in the midst of it and in bringing light into it through the gospel. And that's where we end today. We end with the gospel. We got a hint of it there in verse 40 when the author talked about that there was a better thing, a better hope that God had provided to those first listening to this letter. But to really see it clearly, we have to cheat the chapter numbers a little bit and go ahead to chapter 12, and we're going to read verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. He's giving us a point here both on our purpose as we look at the litany of faith and at the thing that all of those in the litany were focused on all throughout every step of the journey. And he says it's Jesus. It's Jesus the whole way. It talks about who he is, the founder and perfecter of our faith. He's the one that our faith is built on, but he's also the one who, through the work of the Holy Spirit, is perfecting our faith, is helping us to grow more and more in him. It also talks about what he did, enduring the cross, dying to pay the price for the sins of all the imperfect saints in the litany of the faithful and all the imperfect saints here in the room this morning. It's what he accomplished, despising and rejecting the shame of death on a cross, transforming it by bearing the shame and suffering of the world, but then being buried and rising again from the dead, leaving the shame and suffering and sin there in the tomb. And it finally talks about where he is. It says he's seated at the right hand of God as our mediator and high priest, the thing that the whole first half of the book of Hebrews was focused on, that we have Jesus as our advocate. Jesus is the goal, he's the purpose, he's the drive, he's the object of our faith, and we're supposed to set our eyes on him alone. No worldly thing can or should take his place. And our final little passage this morning also gives us an idea of what to do. What is our job in light of who Jesus is? It says, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. I get shivers listening to that. I love this verse. It's fantastic because our author has spent the whole chapter building up this litany of the faithful, imperfect people who took action based on their faith while keeping their eyes on the promises of God. And then he says, you are among them. You are part of them. You are the continuation of this legacy. You are surrounded by this cloud of witnesses. And things will be hard, and there will be times when things are tough, but don't give up. Throw off whatever hinders and run with endurance the race that has been set before you. And trust God for the outcome. We began the message this morning with the story of Dr. William Leslie and his wife Clara, of their failed mission trip to the Congo in the early 1900s. Except our passage, I really think as we're reading through his passage, as we're thinking about the stories of these individuals, we should be reminded that being faithful to God by taking action based on his promises is never a failure. And the stories it relays to us should remind us that God is the one who chooses how to use our actions. Many of the people throughout this hall of faith would have had no idea what was going to come about in the years to come based on the small decisions that they made and the things that they fought for in their lives. In 2010, almost 100 years after Leslie left in disgrace, missionaries from the Aviation Mission Fellowship struck back out into the jungle near the Vanga region of the Congo where Leslie had worked. They had had initial contact with a tribe in the region whose vocabulary suggested to them that they might have rudimentary knowledge of the Bible, of the gospel, and thus might be receptive to learning more. But friends, what they found instead was a thriving and reproducing network of churches in every single one of the small villages in that region of the deep jungle. They found a 1,000-seat stone cathedral that the people had painstakingly built decades before. And then they stopped being able to all fit into it when they gathered together, and so they began building new churches in all of their towns and villages. Each town had its own gospel choir who would write new hymns and songs and come together to share them with each other regularly. The Yansi tribe had become the premier church planters in their corner of the world. See, Dr. Leslie, while focusing primarily on this tribe over here that was right around the Vanga mission station, had taken annual trips out into the deeper jungle to teach the tribes that he could find how to read and write and to try to teach them about the Bible while he was there with them. He never realized that the gospel was taking root amongst one of those tribes deep in the jungle. They never even got a Bible in their own language. They found one in French from a neighboring tribe, and they would make sure with every generation that someone in the village knew how to speak French so that they could translate it back for everybody else. Dr. Leslie died thinking his work had failed. But in the end, he is another part of the cloud of witnesses. Imperfect people who fixed their eyes on God, who took action based on their faith in God's promises, and who left the results up to Him.